On this episode, cryptid researcher Lyle Blackburn recounts the chilling details of an encounter with the Lizard Man, the true story of the Bishopville Monster.
Christopher Davis, panicked. He jumped in the car, started it up, and whatever this thing was really was out to get him, apparently. So it jumped on the car, it tried to grab him. He could see these long black fingernails coming from these hands grabbing at him as he started up the car and began to race off.
This podcast is supported by Paranormal Contractors. Check out their YouTube channel, Paranormal Contractors, for things that go bump in the night. Welcome to your Friday. Lyle Blackburn, the author of The Lizard Man, the true story of the Bishopville Monster, is standing by. We have but a few days left here in Greece, and then we'll be heading to Athens Monday to catch our flight back to Toronto. It's quiet now here in Kalamata. Most of the tourists have gone home. Even the feral cats, which greeted us when we first arrived, have made themselves rather scarce. A few shout-outs to loyal listeners. Glenn Delves from Dublin, Ireland writes, "Love the show, it's my new favorite." Well, thank you, Glenn. I also strongly agree with your political views. Keep fighting the good fight. I also have two boys, aged 9 and 6. I'm a firefighter paramedic here in Dublin. I listen to the show on my Bluetooth earpiece as I work my daily station duties between turnouts, fire and ambulance calls. Take care and keep up the good work. Thank you again, Glenn. Mike Stewart says, "Hi, Richard. I'm located in Duffield, Virginia, and I listen to your podcast on my commute to work and at my place of work." Thank you, Mike. Peter in San Pedro, California. "Hello, Richard. Your shows are tremendous. I listen to you through my TuneIn app. I get your radio program, The Rock and Roll Twilight Zone, and your Conspiracy Unlimited podcast downloaded directly to my Android. I look forward to listening to your shows weekly. You're a great host, and your knowledge is incredible." I'm blushing. Thank you for what you do. God bless you and your family. Thank you, Peter in San Pedro, California. So, when my one son, North, overheard me saying I'd be interviewing Lyle about the Lizard Man, he said, "Lyle is going to be talking about Mark Zuckerberg?" The kid is only 11. I didn't prompt him. He's a very clever boy. Actually, I had no idea Zuckerberg's nickname was Lizard Man. No, this is not about Mark Zuckerberg. It's about an actual lizard-type humanoid creature that terrorized a young man and others down in Lee County, South Carolina in the mid to late 1980s. Lyle Blackburn is a native Texan known for his work in writing music, film, and cryptid research. He's the author of several acclaimed books, including The Beast of Boggy Creek, the aforementioned Lizard Man, and Beyond Boggy Creek. Lyle Blackburn, welcome to Conspiracy Unlimited. How are you?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me.
How did you get interested in this particular cryptid, the Lizard Man?
Well, it was one that I had read about in quite a few cryptozoology books over the years. And once I started doing some research and writing books on these subjects, it was one that I wanted to turn my attention to. So I actually was doing what I called the swamp tour. I was going around the southeast U.S. to various swamps where there had been strange sightings of cryptid creatures. And in the process of that, I went to Bishopville, South Carolina, where the stories of the Bishopville Lizard Man originated. And once I got there, I found out it was more to the story than meets the eye. So I just really became interested in that particular cryptid.
And people down there in Lee County, were they anxious to talk about it? Were they hesitant? Did you have to pry it out of them?
Well, I think it's like any of these cryptid cases. A lot of the folks that live in these areas are, completely uninterested or, believe it's all, hubbub. But there are a few that take it seriously, even if it's in terms of their culture, a story from their area. So I found that, there was enough people interested in speaking about it that I could get the full story.
Now, before we get into the actual sighting back in 1988, let's go down to Lee County. Describe Lee County in terms of, obviously there are a lot of swamps there, but just kind of give me an overview of Lee County, South Carolina. Where is it located in the state and so forth?
Well, it's kind of in the central part of the state. near Sumter. Bishopville is a very rural area. I mean, this is South Carolina, so it's got the typical layout of woodlands and farms and pastures, kind of alternating like that. There's a lot of low areas in that north central part of South Carolina, so you do have swampy areas that alternate in those woodlands. Bishopville, the town, it's a little larger than some, but it's really just something you'd pass through and just barely notice. There's not a lot of tourist attractions or too much along those lines. So it's something that people who live in the area would pass by, but it's not on the route of, general highway destinations. But it's ultimately a very beautiful place. The scenery, if you want to get into the woods or the antebellum architecture of the old homes, really a scenic and beautiful part of America.
All right, so back to the case study here, 1988. What time of year was it?
This all happened in the summer, and it kind of broke in a various strange sequence. But yeah, it was mostly around late June and July of 1988.
And it starts with a local teenager, Christopher Davis. Walk us through what happened.
Well, in some ways, the Christopher Davis sighting is the focal point and the most sensational, but it actually started a few weeks prior to that, and that's kind of the interesting thing. The Lee County Sheriff's Office there got a call from some individuals who lived near Scapor Swamp, who said they got up that morning and their car appeared to be damaged, and it looked like an animal had done it. So, that was kind of a confusing thing. So the sheriff at the time, Sheriff Liston Truesdale, sent a couple of deputies down there. They went down there and investigated, and sure enough, it looked like some significant car damage and animals had done it. So they called the sheriff down there and said, hey, you need to come look at this. We're not sure what to make of it. When Truesdale got down there, he also confirmed that there was animal hair, there was some kind of tracks. It looked like something had either been fighting or something had gone on there, and in the process their car was damaged. And so as Truesdale started asking around some of the locals that started showing up and such, and even some of the local reporters, people suggested that, well, hey, maybe this was the lizard man. And the sheriff, said, well, what do you mean the lizard man? And people said that, well, people around here have been seeing some sort of a large brownish or green humanoid-like creature in the swamps, and we call it the lizard man. So that's kind of what started it right there. And the sheriff, wasn't convinced there was a lizard man, but he kind of put out the word that if anybody knew anything about this, to please come to the office and speak to him. And like I said, in the meantime, the reporters had run a few articles about the car damage, and that's what ended up getting Christopher Davis to come forward a couple of weeks later.
Now, before we get to Davis, just a couple of details. Can you describe the damage to the car? What are we talking about, dents or scratch marks?
In this case, there was scratch marks. A lot of the trim had been ripped off. The car was, somewhat dirty and dusty, and you could see footprints on the car. And as well, there was larger footprints leading off into the woods. The car, it didn't have bite marks or anything like that. There was definitely, dented and the trim ripped enough to where, this wasn't just your average, this wasn't a dog or a cat just simply jumping on the car or anything like that. This was much more significant.
Right. And you mentioned the presence of some sort of animal hair, as if two creatures that had been in some kind of a fight.
Right. That's kind of what it appeared. And they could see that there were what they thought were maybe fox prints or something, in addition to something larger, which Some on the scene surmised maybe that of a bear, although they didn't look quite like a bear. They just weren't sure, but it looked like, possibly a fox and some other creature that was larger.
So really, there is no connection to the lizard man with this particular incident, but what it did was it served to bring another witness to an actual lizard man sighting to the fore. Is that the idea?
Yeah, basically, this was the first time the police heard the mention of this so-called lizard man, and by the word getting out and whatever the reporters ran in the newspaper, that's what sparked this whole thing that was about to go down, and that's what brought a young man into the sheriff's office a couple of weeks later.
And that is 17-year-old Christopher Davis. What happened to young Chris?
Well, Christopher came in and he was with his father, and they said, Sheriff, we got something that we feel like you should know. It may or may not have anything to do with the lizard man or the car damage, but, as we've, talked to people and seen this, we feel you should know. The story that Christopher Davis told Sheriff Truesdale that day, he said that a couple of weeks prior, on June 29th, 1988, he was working late at a fast food restaurant in Bishopville, and it was about 2 a.m. He picked up some food to go after his shift, and he was driving through an area on his way home, and he had to go through the area of Skateboard Swamp. And as fate would have it, I suppose, he had a flat tire out there and had to pull over and change it. Now, this is not the place you want to get a flat tire. It's desolate. There was only about one house anywhere near out there. There was no place to go. He couldn't walk home. So he was definitely forced to go ahead and change the tire.
Just like in the movies, right? Just like in the movies.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like a horror movie setup. This is one of those things that you would think is fiction, but, presumably real life. But so he said that about the time he got finished changing the tire, he was putting the jack and the old tire back in his trunk, he looked up, and in the moonlight he could see something coming at him. And it appeared at first to be perhaps a person. It was upright on two legs. Now, at 2 a.m. in the swamp, that is scary enough. So immediately he starts to get scared, starts to make his way back into the car. And he said, but as this thing got closer, he could tell that it was not a person. He said it looked to be, brownish or green. It was possibly covered in scales. It was maybe 7 feet tall. It walked upright, and it had the distinct characteristic of having 3 fingers. And Christopher Davis, panicked. He jumped in the car, started it up, and whatever this thing was really was out to get him, apparently. So it jumped on the car. It tried to grab him. He could see these long black fingernails coming from these hands, grabbing at him as he started up the car and began to race off.
In other words, he's got the windows rolled down at this point. Probably, South Carolina in the summer, you're not going to roll the windows up.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they were definitely down, and kid probably couldn't afford a car with fine air conditioning. So, he started driving away and managed to kind of dislodge this thing enough to stay out of its grasp, and it actually fell off of the car, and then it got up and continued to chase him down the road as he sped up, 20, 30 miles an hour. It presumably kept up pace and almost got back in the car before he could eventually, get away from the scene. And when he arrived home, he ran in the house. He was, distraught, upset, and his dad was awake. And that's kind of how his dad got brought into this, because obviously he asked Christopher what happened, and believed something had happened to his son. So his father was sort of a corroborating, not a witness, but corroborated, the whole incident.
Right.
When they were telling Sheriff Truesdale.
Now, Chris wasn't late for curfew, and so, was concocting some amazing story. I mean, right? I mean, he was not there was no reason for him to make up a story. He wasn't late for curfew, in other words.
Right. Presumably, yeah, there was no reason for him to come up with something like this. He worked late. He worked the late shift, so it was expected that he would be home late.
Right.
If he had a flat tire, he had a flat tire.
Right. And did he drive home with the flat tire, or did he actually manage to get it switched before the lizard man attacked?
He had just gotten it switched, so in the process of putting away the jack and throwing that blown out tire in the back, that's when the thing appeared. And I should point out, like I mentioned before, he had taken some food to go, and if the window was down, so that's something that was there, that he did have food in the car at the time of the incident.
Right. Did he describe the eyes? Did they look like lizard eyes, snake eyes?
He didn't describe, or I don't believe saw them or looked at them in that much detail. I think if I recall right, he said he might have saw the eyes glowing. I don't know if that's the glint in the moonlight, but he didn't. The reptilian part came mostly from the description of the scaly type skin, and not so much from any sort of snake eyes or anything like that.
Right, but this thing was 7 feet tall. Roughly. Did he describe the build of this? Was it slender? Was it broad-shouldered? Describe the physicality, if you could.
It wasn't overly large or bulky. He drew a crude drawing, which he's, accompanied his statement to the sheriff. And in that drawing, it's very childish, but you can see that the creature is your average sort of adult human type build, maybe even slimmer and lankier than that, but definitely in that zone.
Did it have a tail?
No, he did not see a tail.
And how about the teeth? Did it bear fangs?
He didn't go into detail on that either. I think in the tussle, he mostly got the general description and characteristics of it, but he didn't focus too long on the teeth. And I suppose he did point out that the fingers had long black fingernails, but that's because those were coming in the car window. Those were trying to grab him, so he certainly saw those in more close and personal.
He must have been out of his mind with fright.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's why again his father took him seriously, because Christopher Davis was presumably not an actor, and for him to be that distraught and upset, there was absolutely no doubt that something happened. And even Sheriff Truesdale, who I visited with at length when I was in Bishopville, he said the Christopher Davis was not lying. Now whether this was a lizard man or what it was, remains to conjecture. But he said absolutely that kid was not lying. Something happened. Something traumatic happened to him. Something came after him that night in Scapore Swamp.
So he and his father, at what point did they go to the sheriff? The next morning or that very night?
Well, it was 2 weeks later. So they just, they kept it quiet, not knowing what to say. It sounded so fantastic. They weren't like immediately thinking, well, let's go to the police. We're not sure. People will think you're crazy. So they kind of just kept quiet. And it wasn't until the newspaper stories about the car damage and the so-called alleged lizard man kind of came in the paper that's when his father thought, we better tell the sheriff about this, because this could, there could be more to this.
Now, at a certain point, do they administer a lie detector test?
Later on, about in August, they did a lie detector test, which was administered by the Sumter police captain. And that kind of came because a lot of people, obviously, once all this got out and Christopher Davis's story got in the newspaper and it was printed over and over and over, people, were ridiculing him or accusing him of lying or being drunk. So in an effort to, settle the matter, they ended up giving him a lie detector test, which he passed.
This would be the standard sort of galvanic skin response type test?
I suppose so. I don't have the exacts, but other than the records that they did administer this test, and he passed.
Richard has tiny talking insects living in his sock drawer. We are bugs, and we are living in Richard's sock drawer. Conspiracy Unlimited. With Richard Serrett.
Lyle Blackburn, the author of The Lizard Man, the true story of the Bishopville Monster, is here. We're talking about eyewitness encounters with this lizard-type creature in South Carolina. There were other sightings after Chris Davis. When did they take place approximately?
Well, some of these had occurred previously. For example, once this kind of started coming out in the papers, and especially with Christopher Davis, once that rather sensational and dramatic and horrifying experience got in the papers, everybody in that area began talking about it. One guy came forward and said that about 1 year earlier, he had been near the skateboard bridge one night riding his bike, and he stopped there to get a drink. There's a little artesian well that comes out of that, the water there. It's fresh water, and he had stopped. He was getting a drink when he looked across the bridge, and over there he saw this large humanoid type figure standing in the brush, and it was looking at him. And, first he thought maybe it was a dead tree or what, but the thing moved, and he definitely, knew it was a living creature. He jumped on his bike and rode off, obviously scared. Another gentleman that worked in the area and lived in the area said that 2 years prior, in 1986, he was building something on his property near the swamp when he saw a very bizarre creature behind some trees, and he didn't get a great look at it. But, once all these stories came out, he said, well, perhaps I saw it too, because, he'd seen something. And then after that, there was some other ones. A guy that's a crop duster, Frank Mitchell, that lived in the area, came and said, as he was taking off one morning out of his little runway, he saw a apish, brownish creature of some sort run across the runway and into the trees. So those were some examples, and there was some subsequent sightings that went on there for a couple of more months, and even several in the years to come.
Now, this isn't a local phenomenon. It's just not Lee County, South Carolina. There have been other sightings of reptilian-type humanoids or lizard men in other parts of the country that you've sort of tracked, correct?
Correct. Yes, they are. There's sightings of these. I've got some in Mississippi. There's some in New Jersey. There was some in even Texas, and there was some up in British Columbia. There's even other kind of related creatures, like the Loveland frog in Ohio, which, all added up. There are not a lot of reports. We're not talking like the numbers of Bigfoot reports here, but we definitely have examples of reptilian humanoid type creatures being seen throughout North America over a long period of time.
Any reports of someone being physically attacked, or let's say a pet or an animal being killed by one of these creatures?
For the most part, the sightings are brief, and while very spooky, the creatures don't seem to be aggressive, not like you have in the Christopher Davis incident. The only other one that kind of has something like that would be the Thetis Lake Monster, a story from the 70s in Thetis Lake, British Columbia, where some boys said they saw this reptilian type creature come up out of the water, and it actually, lunged at them and scraped one with its long pointed fingernail as it as they ran off. So I don't put a lot of stock in that Thetis Lake sighting, but that's really the only other example of aggression that I know of.
And the sheriff, did he type up a report? I mean, if you were to go into the Lee County Sheriff's Office and ask for that file, would there be references to a lizard man in that report?
Absolutely. When I visited him in Bishopville several years ago, as I was working on the book, I had access to all the police files, all the photos, everything. He was since retired, but he had taken copies or even the originals of everything that had been written down or done in the investigation. And I literally took my scanner over there and scanned all that stuff. And it's great because in most of these cryptid cases, you don't have usually have a law enforcement that takes it seriously enough to, even have the witnesses write down anything or do a sketch or anything like that. So this was one case that was an exception where I was able to actually look at the police reports. And in the case of one sighting which occurred in around 1990, several people at once had seen it, and the sheriff had the wherewithal to separate them all and make them write down their statements. And I'm able to look at their reactions as they remember them days after the event, not years after. So that was really cool about this case.
Right. And this caught the national attention, the national media's attention. Didn't Dan Rather report on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Lizard Man case has to rank at the top of media frenzy and coverage. Dan Rather from the CBS Evening News interviewed Sheriff Truesdale shortly, probably about 10 days after the Christopher Davis story broke. And shortly after that, Good Morning America literally did a live broadcast from the Scapore Swamp featuring interviews with Sheriff Truesdale and other things. So it, as well as all the regional and newspapers were running articles, the radio, it was just crazy.
And whatever happened to young Chris Davis?
Well, unfortunately, Chris was murdered, actually, killed in his home in 2009.
Oh dear! Just a break and enter gone wrong, or was it premeditated murder? What happened?
Well, Chris, I don't think made the best life choices later in life, and as far as I know, he got involved in perhaps drugs or drug dealing, and he was living, near Bishopville at the time, still in South Carolina, when he was at home with his family, and some guys literally just came in the house with a shotgun and shot him.
Oh dear.
And so it was rather tragic. And in some ways, Christopher Davis, I'm sure he wished he had never come forward and said anything about that encounter, because for the rest of his life, he kind of was, the Lizard Man guy. And I'm sure he had a lot of problems that resulted from people ridiculing him, from constantly bringing up the Lizard Man story and things like that. And, I don't think he had the best of times in his life, and that may or may not have played into his involvement with unscrupulous individuals. I don't know.
That's terrible. That is a very tragic story. And Sheriff Truesdale is no longer with us.
Right. He passed away a couple of years ago. Unfortunately, he was when I had visited him during my research, his wife had passed away about 6 months earlier, and they were, married many, many, many years. And he, just from there, just died of natural causes.
Right. And one has to wonder, given the media attention, why wouldn't Bishopville have embraced the Lizard Man the way that Point Pleasant, West Virginia, embraced the Mothman? I mean, it's become a cottage industry. It's become a huge tourist attraction. Bishopville, I guess, not interested in going that route?
Well, no, not so much. And you find the resistance from town officials. I think even in the case of the Mothman, I think they had to do some convincing that this would bring in tourists or be of interest. Bishopville, other than the South Carolina Cotton Museum, where they do have things on display to look at, and they've got some lizard man memorabilia. The town itself has been very standoffish about this. They've played it into some of their like cotton festivals where they have a lizard man dressed up, and they kind of do it in a playful way. But it's really only been this summer they actually had a lizard man festival, which was organized by someone who doesn't live in Bishopville, who saw the value of this and tried to get something going, because like the Mothman, it's relatively famous to those that follow these kind of mysterious monster cases. So perhaps in the future, this festival thing will get more attention and build up to the level of where Mothman is.
What about I believe it's the Cherokee that are one of the major Native American nations in that state. Anything in the Cherokee legends about a lizard man?
Yes, and in fact, that's one of the more kind of spooky and interesting things about this, because if you look back to some of their legends or stories and tales from the tribes that lived in that South Carolina area, they do describe a race of what they called a race of beings or men that had come from the sea, and they described them as being scaly and presumably reptile-like, and they had what was described as these short, foot-long, hard, rigid tails. And they said that they had to usually dig a hole or sit on a log in order for them to sit comfortably as they were on land. And they said they would occasionally come up and be seen in the forest there until such time as the fish dried up, and then they no longer saw these beings anymore. So, I mean, if you look at this, you're essentially getting sort of a lizard man type creature report, all the way back to Native American times. And for the coincidence, there's no way Christopher Davis or any of these other folks would have even known about this stuff at the time. So it's quite coincidental or ironic that reports so many years later in modern times of a lizard man would originate from the very same area where these Cherokee legends existed. And
what about, is there a possible connection between the lizard man and the reptilians, this race of aggressive aliens that some people believe, some UFO researchers believe inhabit sort of the inner earth, that they've always been here?
Well, certainly that comes into play. I mean, when you in terms of a cryptozoology case where you're dealing with a reptilian humanoid, it's not quite as clear cut, and you do have those theories or possibilities of the creature being something other than just some extant or relic dinosaur of some kind, and the beliefs that the subterranean creatures living underground that perhaps surface and would be seen is something to look at in this case. And I kind of researched as far as caves and entrances to the underworld there. There's not a lot of caves there in South Carolina, so but it's all pure conjecture, and certainly something that, if we presume these people saw something of this description, how in the world do we explain it,
Right. The problem I would have drawing a connection between this reptilian race of extraterrestrials is that this lizard man sounds rather primitive. And the Cherokee legend has, eating fish and so forth. My understanding of the reptilian race is they're a fairly, technologically advanced species of aliens. Is that your understanding?
Yeah, I would agree. I think the fact that this creature, is being seen in a very dreary and rugged swamp-like environment where you would find perhaps, creatures that could stay relatively hidden. It would be kind of strange that, that's where the alien race would choose. I also don't find any corresponding UFO activity with the sightings. Some of these cases, you have a flurry of UFO sightings or skyward activity, and then suddenly people start reporting everything from Bigfoot to reptilians. But in this case, just in my mind, just was very much of a kind of creature from the Black Lagoon in modern times. It was just some seemingly a creature of the swamp, and I could find no real connection to extraterrestrials.
What are you working on now, Lyle?
A number of things currently, as always. I'm looking into another sort of famous cryptid case of Momo, the Missouri Monster, which next year I'll be releasing a book. I also work with Small Town Monsters, which has done a lot of documentary films of these sorts. I usually narrate those films. We got a new one coming out October 5th called Bray Road Beast, about the werewolf type creature sightings in Wisconsin. And I've got quite a few appearances coming up. And in fact, in a couple of weeks, I'll be a speaker at the Mothman Festival, as we mentioned. So lots of things going on.
And the Lizard Man, the true story of the Bishopville Monster, still available? You still sign, you still autograph copies and send those off to folks?
I sure do. If you get them from my site at lyleblackburn.com, those do come autographed, and all my books are available there, as well as the other usual places.
Got to ask you very quickly about Monstro Bizarro, an essential manual of mysterious monsters. Do you have a favorite of all of the cryptids that you've investigated? Which one in there is your favorite?
Well, I think my favorite's always going to go back to the Beast of Boggy Creek, the Boggy Creek Monster, the Fouke Monster, the subject of the old movie, The Legend of Boggy Creek. And that was something that occurred close to me. I live in Texas, and that was in Arkansas. And that was the subject of my first book, The Beast of Boggy Creek. So it's always near and dear to me because it's sort of my home legend, and the one that sort of got me. That's why I'm on here, is because I just decided I should write that book, and that kind of got everything rolling. So it's the Boggy Creek Monster is my guy.
Terrific. And people can find all of your books at lyleblackburn.com, L-Y-L-E, Lyle Blackburn, just as it sounds, Blackburn, lyleblackburn.com, and just click on Works. And you'll see all of his books there, Beyond Boggy Creek, In Search of the Southern Sasquatch, The Beast of Boggy Creek, and of course, Lizard Man, the true story of the Bishopville Monster. Lyle, I appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Likewise, my friend. Be well. Okay, before I say goodnight to the moon over Messenia, I'm going to tell you what's coming up next on episode 116.
Hey, this is Tony Merkel, host of The Confessionals, a blog talk radio podcast that brings you weekly interviews with eyewitness accounts of strange and unexplained events. From paranormal activity to UFO encounters to Bigfoot sightings, step into The Confessionals as we explore mysterious, real-life stories. Check us out on your favorite podcast app or theconfessionalspodcast.com. And many thanks to Conspiracy Unlimited for having me on the air. I'll see you all on The Confessionals.
Coming up next, Brad Olson on sacred sites around Lake Huron, plus strange artifacts in the Antarctic. Until then, I'm Richard Serrett. So long for now.
A new Conspiracy Unlimited with Richard Serrett drops every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at conspiracyunlimitedpodcast.com. Blow your mind. That is all for now.